In 211 BCE, Rome minted a coin that contained 95% pure silver. That coin was called the denarius, and for the next 400 years it was the most trusted unit of money on earth. Soldiers were paid in it. Merchants priced their goods against it. Emperors stamped their face on it. The entire Roman economy ran on its weight and its purity. By 268 CE, that same coin contained 2.5% silver. Let that sink in. Not 2% less. Not a modest trim around the edges. 95% silver, down to 2.5%. In less than 5 centuries. And the Roman state kept insisting, until the very end, that the coin was worth exactly what it had always been worth. Here is the number that should stop you cold. Wheat prices in Rome in 301 CE were approximately 70 times higher than they had been 2 centuries earlier. Not 7 times, 70. The coin did not change in name. It did not change in appearance. But the thing it could actually buy had been destroyed. Quietly, deliberately, one emperor at a time. 26 different emperors oversaw this process during the worst 50 years alone. One every 2 years on average. Each one inherited a debased currency, a restless army that needed paying, and a treasury that was empty. And each one made the same choice. Here is the question nobody asks. At what point did debasement stop being a temporary measure and become a permanent trap? There is one specific decision, one specific year, one specific coin, after which no Roman emperor, not one, across 150 years, ever found a way back. That is what this video is about. I am the money architect. And if you want to understand why every currency in history that has been managed by governments has eventually lost its value, the story of the denarius is the clearest case study that exists. Watch this one to the end, because the mechanism Rome used is not a relic. You are living inside a version of it right now. Before we go any further, what do you think was the single worst decision in Roman monetary history? Was it Nero's first cut in 64 CE? Was it Caracalla's double-denarius fraud in 215 CE? Was it Diocletian's price caps in 301 CE? Comment below. I will address every answer at the end of this video. To understand what Rome destroyed, you first need to understand what Rome built. The denarius was not just a coin. It was an institution. When Rome introduced it during the Second Punic War in 211 BCE, the city was fighting for survival against Hannibal. Silver was scarce. Bronze coinage had failed. The denarius, 4.5 grams of nearly pure silver, gave the Roman state a monetary instrument that worked across its entire territory. Soldiers trusted it. Traders in Egypt, Gaul, and Spain accepted it. It was portable, divisible, and its value was guaranteed by its weight. That guarantee mattered more than you might think. In the ancient world, coins were money, not because a government said so. They were money because they contained a specific quantity of precious metal. Every merchant who accepted a denarius was really accepting 4.5 grams of silver. The coin was just a convenient form. Remove the silver. The coin becomes nothing. For the first 200 years of the Roman Empire, the system held. Augustus, who became Rome's first emperor in 27 BCE, actually increased the silver content of the denarius to approximately 98%. He understood that monetary credibility was political credibility. A strong coin meant a strong state. A debased coin meant a state that could not be trusted. Augustus did not debase, he restored, and for the reigns of Tiberius and Claudius after him, the standard held. Here is what most people get wrong about the Roman monetary collapse. They imagine it as a sudden catastrophe, a crisis that erupted, a bad emperor who panicked and shaved the silver off. That is not what happened. What happened was a slow, policy-driven, deliberate erosion carried out across 2.5 centuries by dozens of separate rulers who each made a rational short-term decision that compounded into a civilizational disaster. The Roman state did not stumble into debasement. It chose it, repeatedly. And you need to understand why a rational government would make that choice. Because the logic that drove Rome is not ancient. It is the same logic that drives monetary policy today. Rome's empire was expensive. That is the starting point. By the 1st century CE, the Roman army numbered somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 soldiers. Every one of them needed to be paid, housed, and equipped. The Praetorian Guard alone, the emperor's personal security force in Rome, consumed a disproportionate share of the treasury. Add to that the grain dole for Rome's urban poor, the infrastructure of roads and aqueducts, the cost of frontier wars against the Parthians in the east and Germanic tribes in the north. The Roman state had obligations it could not reduce without risking revolt. And its revenues were not growing fast enough to keep pace. The easy money from conquest, the gold and silver looted from defeated enemies, the tribute extracted from new provinces, had slowed. By the 2nd century CE, Rome was not conquering new wealth. It was administering existing territory. And administering territory costs money. It does not generate the same torrents of plunder that conquest does. So the treasury faced a structural gap. Obligations rising, revenue constrained. And between those two lines sat one very tempting solution. You do not need more silver if you can make each coin contain less of it. In 64 CE, the Great Fire of Rome burned for 6 days and 7 nights. When it was over, 10 of Rome's 14 districts were damaged or destroyed. The emperor at the time was Nero. He needed money to rebuild. He needed money to pay the soldiers. He needed money to maintain the grain supply for a city suddenly short of warehouses. And so Nero made a decision that would echo through the next 240 years of Roman history. He reduced the silver content of the denarius from 98% to 90%. He also shaved the coin slightly, reducing its weight from approximately 3.9 grams to 3.4. With the same amount of silver, his mints could now produce roughly 10% more coins. He could pay his debts without raising taxes. He could rebuild without asking the Senate for permission to drain the treasury. To the average Roman citizen on the street, nothing had changed. The coin looked the same. It weighed almost the same. The emperor's face was still on it. The government still accepted it for taxes. You could still take your denarius to the bread market and buy a loaf. But the money changers knew. The merchants who handled thousands of coins every week knew. The traders in the grain markets knew. A coin that is 90% silver is not the same as a coin that is 98% silver. The gap is small, but the direction is visible. And in markets, direction matters more than the current level. Here is the part nobody tells you. Nero's debasement was not catastrophic on its own. 8% is a real reduction, but not a collapse. What Nero created was not an immediate crisis. Created a precedent. And a precedent, once established inside a monetary system, is almost impossible to reverse. Think about what the next emperor faced. He inherited a currency already reduced to 90% silver. He inherited the same military costs. He inherited the same infrastructure obligations. And if he restored the denarius to 98% silver, which would have required finding 8 cents more silver from somewhere, he would be taking money away from the army, away from the grain dole, away from the Praetorian Guard. No emperor who attempted to restore the currency ever survived long enough to be remembered for it. So the next emperor held the line, or trimmed a little more. Under Trajan, who reigned from 98 to 117 CE, the silver content dropped to approximately 80%. Trajan is remembered as one of Rome's great emperors. His military campaigns were brilliant. His public building program transformed the capital, and under his watch the denarius lost another 10 points of silver purity. Nobody calls Trajan a monetary criminal. He was solving today's problem with tomorrow's currency. By the time of Marcus Aurelius, widely considered the closest Rome ever came to a philosopher king, the denarius contained approximately 70% silver. The Antonine Plague had struck in 165 CE, killing up to 10 million people across the empire. Armies needed paying. Frontier defenses needed reinforcing. The treasury was under sustained pressure. Marcus Aurelius debased. There is a concept economists use for what happened next. The concept is Gresham's law. You have likely heard the simplified version. Bad money drives out good. What it means in practice is this. When two coins circulate at the same face value but different intrinsic values, people hoard the better coin and spend the worse one. Roman citizens understood this intuitively. They kept their old high silver denarii. They paid their taxes and bought their bread with the new debased coins, which meant the government received debased coins as revenue, which meant its real purchasing power fell even as the nominal quantity of coins it issued rose. The debasement was not solving the fiscal problem, it was deepening it. And every emperor who understood this continued anyway, because the army needed paying today, not next year. By 193 CE, Rome had a new emperor. His name was Septimius Severus. Severus came to power after a year of civil war, so bloody it is still known as the Year of the Five Emperors. He fought his way to the throne. He understood that his hold on power rested entirely on one thing: the loyalty of the legions. So he raised military pay dramatically. He expanded the army. He fought wars on 3 fronts simultaneously: in Parthia, in Scotland, in North Africa. His campaigns were expensive by any standard. The denarius under Severus dropped to approximately 50% silver. Half. The coin that Augustus had minted at 98% purity was now, 180 years later, half base metal. Severus died in 211 CE in the city of York, in what is now northern England, while conducting a campaign against the Scottish tribes. He left the empire to his 2 sons, Caracalla and Gaeta. Within a year, Caracalla had his brother murdered, and then Caracalla made the decision that changed everything. In 215 CE, Caracalla introduced a new coin. He called it the Antoninianus. On the surface, the Antoninianus was a double-denarius. Its official face value was 2 denarii. It was slightly larger than a denarius. It carried a radiate crown on the emperor's portrait, a visual signal of its elevated denomination. The Roman public was told this new coin was worth twice the old one. But here is what Caracalla actually put inside it. The Antoninianus contained approximately 1.5 times the silver of a single denarius. Not twice, 1.5. Which meant that every time a Roman citizen accepted an Antoninianus at face value, 2 denarii, they were handing over 2 denarii worth of goods or labor in exchange for 1.5 denarii worth of actual silver. The gap, half a denarius of silver per transaction, went directly to the imperial treasury. This was not debasement in the old sense. This was a structural fraud embedded into the monetary architecture of the empire. Nero had reduced the purity of an existing coin. Caracalla had created a new coin whose denomination was a lie from the moment it was minted. But it gets worse. Because once the Antoninianus entered circulation, the denarius, the old coin with higher silver content, began to disappear. Gresham's law again. Citizens used the overvalued Antoninianus for everyday transactions. The undervalued denarius they kept. By 238 CE, the denarius had been largely withdrawn from circulation. Antoninianus was now the dominant coin, and then the debasement of the Antoninianus began. The crisis of the 3rd century runs from 235 to 284 CE. In those 49 years, the Roman Empire produced somewhere between 26 and 50 emperors, depending on how you count usurpers. The average reign was under 2 years. Many emperors lasted months. Some lasted weeks. Every single one of them needed to pay their soldiers immediately or face assassination. Every single one of them debased. By 253 CE, the silver content of the Antoninianus had fallen to roughly 20%. By 260 CE, the year Emperor Valerian was captured by the Persian king Shapur I, the first Roman emperor ever taken prisoner by a foreign power. It had fallen to 15%. By 268 CE, when Emperor Gallienus was murdered by his own officers in a coup, the Antoninianus contained 2.5 to 5% silver. The coin that Caracalla had introduced as a double denarius was now a copper slug with a surface wash of silver so thin it would wear off within weeks of handling. The Roman monetary system had not collapsed. It had been hollowed out, one emperor at a time, across half a century of political chaos, until what remained was a shell of the thing it had once been. By 284 CE, when a general named Diocletian seized power and declared himself emperor, the Roman economy was in open crisis. Barter had returned to large parts of the empire. Merchants refused debased coins and demanded payment in kind, grain, oil, cloth. Soldiers, who were supposed to be paid in silver, demanded equivalent goods instead, because the coins they received were worth almost nothing by the time they tried to spend them. Tax collection had partially broken down because the taxes were being paid in coins that the government itself could not use at face value. The market had figured out what the state refused to admit. Diocletian was not a stupid man. He understood what had happened, also understood that he could not easily undo it. You cannot restore 90 years of debasement with a decree. You cannot give silver back to coins that contain none. What you can do, what governments have all when they lose control of the monetary system, is announce that the problem is not the money. The problem, Diocletian told the Roman Empire in 301 CE, was greed. In that year, Diocletian issued the Edictum de Pratiis Rerum Venalium, the edict on maximum prices. It set price ceilings on more than 1,200 goods and services across the entire empire. Wheat, wine, wool, wages for laborers, barbers, and lawyers. The maximum price of a modius of wheat, roughly 8 3/4 liters, was set at 100 denarii. That figure, historians estimate, was approximately 70 times higher than wheat prices 2 centuries earlier. 70 times. In 2 centuries. That is what the debasement had done to prices. Diocletian's edict was inscribed in stone and displayed in public squares across the empire. Violators faced the death penalty. The emperor framed the entire document not as a monetary problem, but as a moral one. Merchants were greedy. Speculators were criminals. The solution was punishment, not reform. And this is where it gets genuinely uncomfortable, because Diocletian's edict failed completely. Within months, goods began disappearing from official markets. Merchants preferred to hold stock rather than sell at a loss. Black markets emerged. The official price caps functioned as a tax on honest traders and a gift to those willing to break the law. Diocletian could not enforce price controls across an empire stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia with the administrative tools available to a 3rd century government. The edict was gradually abandoned. Diocletian eventually retired in 305 CE. He built himself a palace in what is now Split, Croatia. He grew cabbages. He refused to return to power when asked. The empire he left behind still had no functioning monetary system. When his successor Constantine reformed the currency in the 310s, introducing the solidus, a new gold coin struck at consistent purity. It stabilized the Eastern Empire for several more centuries. But the denarius, the coin that had financed Rome at its height, was gone. The monetary standard that Augustus had maintained at 98% pure silver had been destroyed beyond recovery. It took a completely new currency to replace it. You already know where this is going. When a government debases its currency, it does not announce the debasement. It announces a temporary measure, an emergency response, a targeted intervention to protect ordinary people from profiteering. The debasement is never presented as what it is. It is presented as a solution. And by the time the public understands that the money in their hands is worth less than it was, the gap has already been transferred to the state. Diocletian blamed the merchants. The merchants had simply been doing arithmetic. Here is why debasement kept happening in Rome even after every emperor could see where it led. The logic of debasement is asymmetric. The benefits arrive immediately. The costs arrive later. And the people who pay the costs are not the same people who received the benefits. When Nero debased the denarius in 64 CE, the new coins entered the economy through the imperial treasury. The government spent them first. The soldiers received them first. The contractors who rebuilt Rome after the fire received them first. At that moment, the moment of initial spending, the debased coins still circulated at face value, because the market had not yet repriced against the new reality. The government got full purchasing power for money it had cheapened. But then the coins spread into the grain markets, into the provincial towns, into the hands of farmers and craftsmen who had no way to know. and no recourse if they did know. And over months and years, as more debased coins circulated, prices adjusted upward to reflect the lower silver content. The inflation arrived, but it arrived downstream, spread across thousands of individual transactions, invisible as a tax, and blamed on everything except its actual cause. This is not a bug in the system. It is the system. The debasement is a transfer, from the last person to receive the new money to the first, from the citizen to the state, from the soldier's purchasing power in 10 years to the emperor's purchasing power today. And nobody voted for it. The Roman citizen was not consulted. The Roman Senate did not pass a debasement bill. The Roman public did not wake up one morning to a headline that read, "Your savings are now worth 8% less." What happened was slower and quieter. The bread cost a little more. The wine cost a little more. The landlord raised the rent. The tax collector demanded the same nominal number of denarii, but the denarii now contained less silver, which meant the effective tax rate had quietly risen. Hold that thought, because what is also true is this: the people who understood what was happening, the wealthy traders, the money changers, the land-owning aristocracy, protected themselves. They held gold. They held land. They held grain. They held any asset that retained intrinsic value as the coin was stripped of its own. Aurelio Bernardi, the Italian historian who spent decades studying Roman monetary records, documented exactly this. The debasement did not destroy wealth uniformly. It destroyed the wealth of the people who held coins and created an opportunity for the people who held assets. The Roman monetary collapse did not impoverish everyone equally. It transferred wealth from those who trusted the currency to those who did not. It was a tax on trust, and the people who paid it most heavily were the people with the least ability to recognize what was happening or move out of the way fast enough. They were ordinary people. Soldiers paid in coins they could not convert fast enough. Pensioners living on fixed stipends. Small traders whose prices were slow to adjust. People who did exactly what they were supposed to do. Earned money, saved it, trusted the institution, and found themselves holding less and less purchasing power with every passing year. Sound familiar? You are not Roman. The coin in your pocket is not made of silver. But the mechanism is identical. In 1971, the United States government severed the dollar's last formal link to gold. Before that year, every dollar in circulation was theoretically convertible to gold at a fixed rate. After that year, it was not. The dollar became a fiat currency, worth what the government said it was worth, backed by nothing except institutional confidence. Since 1971, the US dollar has lost approximately 97% of its purchasing power. The Roman denarius went from 95% silver to 2.5% over 4 centuries. The dollar's purchasing power has followed almost the same arc in 1/8 of the time. The mechanism is different. There is no mint shaving silver from your banknotes. What there is instead is a central bank expanding the money supply, a government running structural deficits, and an institutional consensus that a small amount of annual inflation is not only acceptable, but desirable. 2% per year sounds harmless. It is not. 2% compounded over 30 years cuts the purchasing power of your money by roughly 45%. Of 50 years, It cuts it by 63%. The people who understand this do what Rome's wealthy citizens did. They move into assets, property, equities, commodities. Anything with intrinsic value that does not depend on a government's promise. The people who do not understand it keep their savings in the debased currency and watch it slowly erode. This is not a conspiracy. It is arithmetic. What you are watching when you watch the Roman denarius go from 95% silver to nothing is a government choosing the inflation tax over the visible tax, because the visible tax generates political resistance. You can vote against a politician who raises your income tax. You cannot vote against the slow erosion of your savings. It happens without a bill, without a debate, without a single official ever standing up and saying, "We are taking 8% of your purchasing power this year." They never say that. They never said it in Rome either. And the answer is not what they taught you in school. You were taught that inflation is caused by supply shocks, by oil crises, by pandemics, by greedy corporations. Sometimes those things contribute, but the Roman record is precise. The inflation did not precede the debasement. It followed it, always. The coin was cut first. Prices rose second, in every reign, across every emperor, without exception. The denarius did not collapse because Rome ran out of silver. It collapsed because 26 consecutive governments found it easier to take a little silver out of the coin than to tell the army it could not have a pay rise. The question for you is not what happened in Rome. That is settled history. The question is, what are you doing with your savings in a system that has already committed to 2% annual erosion as official policy? You asked at the beginning of this video what the single worst decision in Roman monetary history was. Here is the answer. It was not Nero's 8% cut in 64 CE. That was bad. It was recoverable. It was not Septimius Severus halving the silver content under military pressure. That was destructive. Still reversible. The single worst decision was Caracalla's Antoninianus, 215 CE. Not because of what it took out of the coin, but because of what it built into the system. Caracalla did not just debase. He redesigned the currency so the debasement was structural and invisible. A coin worth 2 denarii on its face. 1.5 denarii of actual silver inside. Every transaction transferred the difference automatically, without the recipient able to object or even know. Once that architecture existed, the Antoninianus could only go in one direction. You cannot put silver back into a coin already accepted at face value. The market has priced it. Any restoration requires admitting the fraud publicly. No emperor did. By 268 CE, 53 years after Caracalla's first Antoninianus, the coin was 2.5% silver, not because 53 years of emperors were stupid, because each one inherited a system designed to extract. None could stop without losing the army. Losing the army meant dying. That is the trap. Cross the line from opportunistic debasement to structural debasement. There is no road back. The Roman story is not a history lesson. It is a warning. The denarius is gone. But the logic that destroyed it is alive in every monetary system on earth today, in different forms, wearing different names. The debasement is not announced. It is a policy choice that transfers purchasing power from those who trust the currency to those who control it. Subscribe if you want to keep tracking this. And one question for the comments. Roman citizens who understood the debasement moved into gold, land, and grain. In 2025, what assets do you think serve the same function? Tell me below. History does not repeat. But if you do not understand it, it will crush you all the same.